was Instinct of Survival and Multinational Corporation from Napalm Death, Scum. Welcome to the Requiem Metal Podcast. I'm your host, Jason.
And I'm Mark, and joining us on via satellite is Mr. Albert Mudrian from Decibel Magazine, among other things.
And Choosing Death. So welcome, Albert. How are things going today?
Things are great. Thank you for having me, gentlemen.
Our pleasure.
And this is Albert's second appearance with us. Way back in the early days of Requiem Podcast, we did a couple episodes with you after the At the Gates reunion tour.
That's true. We did some kind of rogue guerrilla style episodes at the Decibel office in the summer of 2008. I remember it well.
Yeah, that was cool. But from a production standpoint, we had no game plan. Like, as you said, it was a guerrilla rogue session. We literally just would try and create maybe breaks and kind of go, oh, okay, well, I think now we'll play this song.
Yeah.
And it was pretty...
Well, I think the following episode was basically just talking about choosing death, and it was very, very freeform.
Yeah.
Throwing a couple songs in here and there, but and that's what we're going to do today. But we're going to talk about Napalm Death.
Yeah, and
who doesn't love Napalm Death?
You're a bit of an expert, right?
I would never go so far to call myself an expert on anything.
Extreme
perhaps.
Enthusiast.
Yeah, I'm an enthusiast. If you want to say that I'm maybe an expert about the Philadelphia Phillies over the past 20 years, I could back that. But when it comes to music, I'm a fan. But Napalm are definitely one of my favorite bands of all time, and I've followed them very, very closely for a long time.
How about if we'll refer to you as an astute documentarian of their history, because you've written a book, and so you've actually had to do a lot of research and things like that. So.
Well, yeah, that sounds slightly pretentious, but I'm willing to roll with it just for you guys.
Okay.
It's not a press junket for the book. So.
No, not at all. And before we go any further, we'd like to also thank Nick Green as our executive producer for this episode. Kind of ironically, Nick Green sort of fell on the same episode as you, because you guys are, I guess, co-workers of some sort and also friends, so...
Wow. Yeah, I've known that guy long time. So nice to see that he's given something back. Way to go, Nick.
Yes, giving back to the NPR of the metal community, I guess, which is maybe us, a great nonprofit. So.
Yeah, if we only had the federal funding that PBS once had.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah, I was about to say, you guys are going to have about the same amount of funding soon.
Yay. But we actually kind of did things a little less guerrilla organized for this episode than we did the last time we talked to Albert. So we actually wanted to sort of cognitively approach the history of this band. And the reason we kind of kicked off with, I think, Multinational and Instinct of Survival is it gives you sort of, I guess, a nice taste of some of the... the aspects of this early era of Napalm before we go way back into, I guess, the demo and punk stages. I think with Multinational, you sort of hear, some of the, I guess, the more Swans-like elements, maybe industrial kind of weird things happening. And then Instinct of Survival kind of has the Celtic Frost riffing mixed with the sort of blown out bass and the, basically all the elements are there. I mean,
but we kind of come to know as Napalm,
Yeah. So I mean, when we talk about Napalm Death, before we get, I guess, back into the real early history, I mean, what is it about this band that's in your eyes has kind of left such a historical legacy?
Wow. I mean, well, first of all, you have to mention their longevity, We're going to listen to some songs that are, they're almost 30 years old. So just that alone, I think, is a defining trait. Longevity, the fact that they are progenitors of a couple different styles, really, of extreme music. But I think for me in particular, when I think about Napalm, I just think about the energy and the aggression. And there are plenty of other bands, as everybody, who listens to this podcast are aware of. There's plenty of aggressive, fast, energetic, extreme metal and hardcore and punk or whatever kind of bands out there. But there's something about Napalm that when they were doing it, nobody had quite captured that vibe the way they did before them. So, I think that's kind of what you look for when you're looking for a band that is really a visionary in terms of this style of music.
Now, what kind of? I mean, I mentioned a few of the influences that sort of come out there. You know, I guess as we approach this, like the history or at least the beginnings of this band, you know, what were, I guess, some of the progenitors that created the Napalm sound? I mean, what like influenced these guys to become what they are? You know, that you hear in even like songs like Multinational or Instinct of Survival.
Well, I think there's a bunch of different things working there. Obviously, there's a very European vibe to it, you know. You've got the kind of discharge-ish early anarcho-punk influence that was going on around that time in the late 70s and early 80s in England. You've got some even, I think there's even a little bit of kind of post-punk stuff going on that you can hear in Multinational. I know you mentioned Swans. I think you can also hear maybe a little bit of Killing Joke in there and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I think that there was basically just this undercurrent of heavy, aggressive, completely uncommercial at every turn music that they were kind of throwing together into this interesting amalgam of stuff that was really part metal, part hardcore when you broke it down. As I think it was either Justin Broderick or Mick Harris, I can't remember, who's quoted in Choosing Death as saying that originally when they were kind of finding their sound a little later on, by the time they were doing, you know, the Hatred Surge demo and the From Enslavement to Obliteration demo, they wanted to be a cross between Siege and Celtic Frost.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's, in a lot of ways, they really did achieve that early on, especially like on side A of Scum. So I think that there are some influences that are much clearer than others, like Siege and like Frost. But then there is that stuff that isn't maybe as apparent until you go back and listen to it again, like Killing Joke, like Swans, like Crass, like Discharge.
Yeah. And I think you hear, like, I guess maybe, like, for me, I hear a lot of the Crass stuff in the song that we're going to kind of start the next set off with. Their kind of Crucifixion of Possession off the Bullshit Detector. You know, like, I hear a lot of the vocal influence, especially of, like, a Crass in that sort of tune. But you're right. So often it's Discharge that's mentioned, it's Siege and stuff like that. And some of these other things, like Killing Joke and stuff, you know, don't really ever get thrown into the mix very often.
I think a lot of it kind of comes from, well, you agree or disagree, I guess, but a lot of just the competition between the scene of one-upsmanship of, we got to go faster. This didn't happen super early on, but I think that was always kind of the thread, was that competition between the scene, those bands, you know, that would play at the Mermaid every, you know, couple days or whatever.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely the bands like, you know, Heresy, who were a local band as well, or semi-local band. There's a lot of tales of the drum wars between their old drummer, whose name escapes me at the moment, and Mick Harris, and those kind of weekly drum battles were definitely pushing them to get faster and faster. Steve Charlesworth, I just remembered it. Hooray. But yeah, you definitely had bands kind of feeding off each other at a certain point, but early on, when, you know, even when we talk about that Crucifixion of Possession song that we were going to play, that is so Crass influenced. It's ridiculous. I mean, it just sounds like Crass. Lyrically,
like, do they owe us a living? You know?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I mean, it was recorded in 1983, and it was on one of their earliest demos. And I forget the name.
I think was the CAC demo.
It might
83?
be. Yeah. I honestly, I can't remember, just because there's probably like at least half a dozen demos, really, before they record Hatred Surge, with different lineups and things like that, you know, pre-Justin, pre-Mick. And, I mean, the fact that track wound up on Bullshit Detector, I mean, that was Crass's compilation. You know, they kind of helped put that stuff together and put it out on their own label. So, obviously, Crass found something they liked in it, probably because it sounded just like what they were doing at times. But, you know, not long after that, just, you know, a couple short years later, they'd be changing their sound quite a bit.
So where do these guys, I mean, without getting like exhausting into all of the different, band members interchanging in the early years and stuff, but I mean, if we're talking about the origins, I mean, obviously these guys hail from, the outskirts of Birmingham, the industrial city where Priest and Sabbath and, kind of a hotbed of metal and community and other things, the Brummies, kind of hanging out in there. I mean, where do you start to see the true, I guess, coming together of Napalm into what they became by the time of Scum?
I think that you see that around 85. I think it's really when Nick Bolin meets Justin Broderick, and those two form a connection. Because initially, the band formed with Nick Bolin and their original drummer Miles Ratledge. And if you ask Nick, he can say that it maybe even started in the late 70s, but like they officially became Napalm around 81, 82 when they started using that name regularly. But Napalm, as I think most listeners of the Requiem podcast recognize them, starts around 85 when Nick Bolin meets up with Justin Broderick and they start developing that sound, that those metal influence coming in a bit more than the crass influence that was there earlier. And they would go on to record the Hatred Surge demo, which was the last recording with Miles Ratledge still playing drums. And that's kind of the basis for, what becomes the side A of Scum, essentially. I mean, they don't have Mick Harris yet. They'll get him on the next demo, the From Enslavement to Obliteration demo. But what a lot of the songs that you hear on Scum are on Hatred Surge, and you can they're not quite as fast, but they're definitely on there, and you can hear where they're headed.
Yeah, and we're actually gonna do a comparison after Crucifixion, where we'll play the Hatred Surge version of Instinct of Survival, so that listeners can kind of hear how sped up it was, by the time Scum, rolls around, Yeah. Even though it's a pretty crude recording, but I think, people would expect that from these early, Napalm sort of stuff. I mean, was Broderick like the guy that, because to me it seems, I mean, I don't know because I wasn't in that era, but from everything I've been able to glean from understanding the punk scene in the early 80s and stuff, it seems odd that, all of a sudden they would turn an ear to like Celtic Frost, for instance. Is that Broderick's doing that he's bringing in, like, I guess what would be seen as metal influences into, I guess, a punk scene?
It's hard to say if it was just him that brought that in. I mean, he was kind of all over the place with what he was listening to. And I think the story goes that he and Nick Bolin connected over like a Throbbing Gristle tape or something like that.
Yeah.
So, he was like, he had a pretty wide palette. So I don't know if he was the guy that introduced Celtic Frost in particular. Mm-hmm. I know later on a lot of the metal that gets injected into, Napalm circa 85, 86, or 86, 87 has a lot to do with Shane Embry meeting Mick Harris.
Okay.
And Shane, not being a member of Napalm yet, but him feeding Mick a lot of the underground metal that he discovered via tape trading, and then Mick devouring that and incorporating a lot of that into Napalm's early stuff.
Well, wouldn't you say, like, I guess, Unseen Terror, which was Shane's, I guess, first major band, that was kind of, I guess Drop Dead was his first major band, but Unseen Terror, which I guess got a little bit more exposure, certainly, and recorded and things a little bit better, that was more of like almost a thrash, hybrid with punk, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's definitely kind of a thrashier feel to it. There was a proto grind feel to what they were doing. You see in Mitch Dickinson, who are still to this day contemplating a follow-up record to Human Error. I think we all I think we're ready for that one. Yeah. I think it's kind of like the Chinese democracy of grindcore at this point. But they were definitely doing a there was a lot of metal in what they were doing, more metal than anything else, I think. And even Warhammer, which was kind of around that time, also was a bit more metal influenced. That's where those guys came from. Mitch Dickinson and Shane, they came from metal to start, and their experiences with like kind of hardcore and punk came after that, and they came more or less from showing up at the Mermaid one day.
Just dumb luck kind of thing.
Yeah.
Now, because am I wrong in thinking that, though, that at this point there was kind of an opposition between those two scenes? Or do you think bands like Discharge and Crass had started to loosen the bonds, maybe at least in the Birmingham scene more?
Well, I mean, I think that to that point there hadn't been a lot of acceptance between the metal and the hardcore scenes. But when Shane and Mitch showed up at the Mermaid, they were accepted. Nobody beat them up or anything. And I know they were a little concerned when they walked in there.
Yeah.
But I think that you had it opening up a little bit more just from the likes of some of the earlier extreme metal bands that were playing heavier music, like bands like Venom and even Metallica and Motorhead were bringing a lot more metal into their sound.
Sure. Slayer too.
Yeah, exactly. Like the kids who were into the more aggressive, fast punk could kind of relate to that. Mm-hmm. They could connect with it a bit more. They maybe weren't proficient enough with their own instruments to emulate it, but as they, the longer they played, the better they got. And they were able to kind of take on some of those influences and reinterpret them and express them, through this new style of extreme metal.
Yeah. Now, so these guys all start to come together, like you said, around the Hatred Surge time, correct?
Right.
Okay. And so how do you go from Hatred Surge to, I guess, the true, I guess, debut, which is Scum? Where does that whole kind of come together? We can kind of talk about Scum as like these two entities kind of put together, side A and side B. But side A, I guess, where does that start to develop before Justin and those guys take off?
That happens again at the Mermaid. It all goes back to this club that's, I think, an Indian restaurant now in Birmingham.
So it's like the CBGB of grind, or something.
It really is. It really is. It might even be more important than that to grindcore, because it's such a genesis. It's such a ground zero. There really wasn't anything else comparable to it. Mm-hmm. But yeah, Mick Harris started going to see Napalm, and they were more or less a house band at the Mermaid. So he'd see them all the time. He was Mick Harris, so he was young and excitable to begin with. So he would approach Justin after shows and just tell him how much he was into the band, that he was a drummer, that if they ever needed anybody, that he could do it, he could be the guy, he was super fast, et cetera, et cetera. And I think at that time they were pushing Rat, who was still their drummer in 85, to get faster, and it just wasn't working. Yeah. So they ended up trying out Mick one day, while Rat was still in the band, I think, in fact. And it worked, it just kind of clicked. They were like, wow, he really is fast, and he really is crazy, he's perfect. So they ended up getting rid of Rat, and then the moment that Mickey kind of assimilated himself in that lineup, he became, when he joined in 85, really he joined in 85 or 86, I think it was 85. From that point to the point that when he eventually left in 91, he was in a lot of ways the driving force in Napalm Death for the next, 5, 6, 7 years.
Oh, absolutely.
And from that moment, when they have Mick, then it's like, all right, this is when you're on the path to, at the very least, side A of Scum.
Yeah. Now, was it as simple as some of the stories are that he was essentially driven to just create the fastest, most extreme music that had ever been, done before, and then, whatever musicality sort of grew out of that? Or was it a little bit more contemplated than that?
I don't know if it was all that calculated. Those guys, especially when I think back to the interview process for Choosing Death, asking a lot of those early players, what motivated you to do this, and everybody was like, I don't know, just seemed like we had to play faster. We all wanted to just be faster.
Yeah.
So did Mick Harris set out to be the fastest drummer in the world? I don't know, but I get the sense that when Napalm became more and more renowned for their speed, that he became very conscious of the fact that he could be recognized as that and pushed himself that much further.
And that makes sense. Yeah. That sometimes, I don't think some of these great musicians or these innovators always set out to do things. They maybe, fall on these accidental discoveries and then kind of like push that boundary even further. You know what I mean?
Well, at this point, these kids are incredibly young. You're just kind of going, I think, all on instinct at that point and trying to like show up one another in that kind of youthful, enthusiasm.
Yeah. And globbing like all these really strange, this amalgam of sounds, whether it be Siege or Celtic Frost or whatever you're hearing, and trying to sort of go, let's do a little bit of that in our music, or Throbbing Gristle. I mean, like
emulation.
How do you fit those together?
Being as a kid growing up, being influenced by art, like I like this guy, I'm going to interject some of that into this, a little bit of this, a little that, and I think at a certain point that just starts to fade away, and he's kind of, I think maybe that's when Napalm kind of came into their own.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there was a grand plan with any of these bands really when it comes down to it, and I think that's part of the, again, not to sound pretentious, but some of the artistry that goes into this, like that's what makes this for so many people really just genuine and really easy to connect with.
Now, when did you hear Scum? Was this your first exposure to Napalm, or did you hear later stuff and kind of go backwards? Or, I guess I'm always curious where people's entry points are to certain bands.
I didn't hear Scum until probably 91. My first experience with Napalm is Harmony Corruption. And I think that's the case for the vast majority of people, our age, mid to early 30s. Or early to mid 30s. I wish it went mid to early 30s. I wish it went in that direction.
Unfortunately, that's
not. Because Harmony Corruption was the first record that was really released here.
Yeah.
Scum and From Enslavement didn't come out. They didn't have U.S. distribution for those records when they were released in Europe. It wasn't until Earache hooked up with Combat that the records were kind of formally available in the shops here. So for me, it was Harmony Corruption, and then I kind of worked back after that. So I didn't hear Scum until 91, and I just remember the first time I heard it, I had heard Cathedral before I heard Scum.
Yeah,
so
me too.
I went back and I was just like, when I heard the second part of Scum, I was like, that's Lee Dorian? Really?
Yeah,
I don't understand.
I've pretty much got a very similar kind of track of, getting in at Harmony, and then I think I had Harmony on tape, and then one of my first CDs was like the Mass Appeal Madness EP. But I remember being young at that point. I don't think I had a developed enough ear to understand, because I think I'd heard a little bit of, I've heard like You Suffer and some of the more notorious tracks I think off Scum early on, but it just didn't grab me because it sounded like absolute noise. And I think now going back and listening to Scum after listening to this stuff for over 20 years, I think you can hear way more that's actually there and present.
Sure, and especially side A,
Oh yeah, and then From Enslavement, I don't think I really, because I really didn't get into Dorian's vocals because they're just. They're kind of muddy, to the uninitiated ear, I think, right off the bat. And I didn't really absorb that record until probably, 10, 15 years ago.
and see, I'm an oddball because the first thing I ever heard was Hung from Fear Emptiness, because, that was ninth grade for me. And, Napalm exposure prior to ninth grade is tough to come by, unless you have somebody older that's feeding that stuff to you.
Yeah.
And so then I went from Fear to Harmony, and then I heard Scum, and then I heard Diatribes, and then it was just, I was all over the map. So I'm I guess more the oddball here because I came in at such a bizarre era. I didn't come in any kind of, I guess, classic era of Napalm, but c'est la vie. That's kind of been my approach with a lot of this, is because Mark's from almost like the just barely previous generation, Mark and Chris were, and then I'm like the newbie who came out, when I guess the Fear Factories of the world were like, rocking everything out. I guess I don't know. So.
That's important, though. It's important to come in with a different perspective, because for a lot of people, and I know we're getting a little bit off the track here, but for a lot of people, when they heard a record like Fear, Emptiness, Despair, or Diatribes or something like that to them they were just like, wow, they were totally disenchanted with Napalm.
Yeah,
and for a lot of people, for people who are, say 5 years older than Mark and I, when they heard Harmony Corruption, they were totally bummed out.
That was like a Judas kind of moment for some people.
Oh, what is this crap? It's death metal. It's not grindcore anymore.
And we'll definitely talk about that later with Harmony, because that is such a breaking point for it in a lot of ways. But
so let's since we've got so far into history now, let's go back to Crucifixion of Possession. What do you say?
Oh yeah, let's check out some of this music, and then we can kind of maybe comment a little bit about the differences between side A and side B of Scum. But so we've got the Crucifixion of Possession demo that we talked about, which, if you've never heard this before, be prepared. It is Napalm Death. We do abide by that. Then the Instinct of Survival. We'll go ahead.
Get your Liberty Spikes ready.
Yeah. The Instinct of Survival demo from the Hatred Surge demo from '85, and then we've got a whole series of tunes from Scum, which you'll be hard pressed to be able to write them down by the time they're even over with. The Kill, Scum, Life? ? Parasites, Divine Death. And then we'll end with You Suffer. And so we'll chat a little bit more about those in just a moment.
My blood just between wrong and right. The religion was then a bad boy. Our fathers were pumped and blood. Leaving their mark on the skin of mankind. Pray to their God and worship the good. The light carries on in pain and blood. Baby Mary is on her own. Down in our hope. Once we leave outside, I give her yours, now you give mine. The cherry old well is a physical cause I pop mark on the skin of the earth. Imagery lies, baby cries, mother dies, one. Terry cold life, there's no real action of nation. The poor what's your violent faction. Cry, mine. Make the choice, use your voice. They are the ones who affect the stigmata. I refuse to be motivation. Pursue a parasite session and review to become the crucifixion of possessions.
That was You Suffer, but why? Divine Death, Parasites, Life, Scum, The Kill, Instinct of Survival from the Hatred Surge demo, and then we started things off with Crucifixion of Possession. So that last tune there, Albert, which people, if they weren't paying attention, might not have even known was a tune, You Suffer, was a pretty, I guess, a big deal in some circles because of guys like John Peel, correct?
Yeah, John Peel took to playing that song over the airwaves of his BBC One radio show back in, I guess it was 87 or so. Mm-hmm. And it was fascinating for a lot of people because they'd never heard anything quite like that before. Just, a 2-second song is pretty ridiculous, and I think that was the whole point of it. And I think that if you ask the members of Napalm who actually wrote that track and the ones that went on to record it, I think they'll tell you it was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's kind of taken on a different life of its own years and years later. They still play that song today at every Napalm Death show. If you go see Napalm Death anywhere in the world, no matter what their set list is, you will hear The Kill, you will hear Life, and you will hear You Suffer.
Yeah.
And there's those stories at the Mermaid where they'd play it like 50 times in a row because people kept like egging them on to do it.
It's kind of the come on, feel the noise of grindcore in a way, then, isn't it? Because that was supposed to be a joke song that Quiet Riot, of course, didn't really want to record, and it ended up becoming, I guess, the beginning of the hair metal problem of the 80s. So I don't know. Maybe that's my oddball connection there, but I see it as that. Something that was intended as a joke becomes like almost the flagship of this band for a while. At least getting them a notice and attention. So
it definitely was their calling card, for better or for worse. For a while, it was the band that had the 2-second long song, Napalm Death.
Mm-hmm. Now, like, in terms of the sound of Scum, you've got side A and side B. In side A, you're talking about Justin Broderick on guitar, Harris on drums, and Nick Boland, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And then side B, now we're...
Dorian, Steer, Whiteley,
yep,
and Harris.
Yep, Jim Whiteley on bass, Lee Dorian, who you might have heard of from Cathedral, on vocals, and then, of course, the Bill Steer. What band did he play in? I forget.
I think it starts with a C, right? Crass? No, Carcass. That's right.
Yeah, Carcass.
Firebird it was,
yeah,
wasn't
Firebird,
it?
yeah. That's what he's known for, Firebird. And you can hear, if you were lending a fine tune to that 9-minute set of music there, like in a song like Parasites, for instance, you hear almost a burst of about 5 seconds of Symphonies of Sickness guitar. It's kind of neat. I
think there's definitely more the injection of the metal sensibilities.
Yeah.
From Steer. I think it's very, very obvious as soon as you flip the record over.
And then tunes like Parasites and Divine Death, which are the tunes where you hear Dorian and Steer and stuff like that. I mean, the recording's a lot more crude because side A was professionally recorded, correct? Or at least semi-professionally recorded?
I think they were both recorded at Rich Bitch, if I'm not mistaken. I don't remember for sure, but I think they were recorded at the same studio, just at, obviously with different times, with a different lineup.
Yeah.
It was like, 127 pounds or something is what it cost to record the whole thing.
Something probably crazy like that,
I think it was all 4-track, if I'm not mistaken, but...
Yeah, I don't know.
Doesn't matter. It holds the test of time.
I mean,
it works.
Oh, yeah. I mean, what... Does Napalm with Scum coming out in 87, I guess the question has always been, do they deserve the credit for, I guess, the birth of grindcore, or is it Repulsion? Is it somebody else? I mean, where do you, as I guess a documentarian of some of this stuff, which your pretentious title I gave you earlier, I mean, where does this fit,
Man, yeah, I have no idea, honestly. Here's what I'll say, because I was 10 years old when everybody started playing this.
Come on, Albert.
So I don't know. I wasn't
answer this question.
Hey, man, you guys are from Michigan. You're down the road. You could have been peeking in on Repulsion in '84. I have no idea. But the thing is, Napalm, whether or not that they were the first band to play as fast as they did, you can always argue that maybe Repulsion was playing faster at the time, or that Siege is really the true genesis of modern day grindcore, or even Terrorizer doing something out on the West Coast at the time. Everybody, nobody knows exactly the first moment that the first blast beat was born, but
we know who named it. But
we do know that. But for a global scene, Napalm was the most important band because they were the band that introduced that style of music to the world, more or less. Indirectly through John Peel in England, and then it kind of grew from there. Because, before that was happening, before Earache was releasing that record, or before it was being played on BBC One, it was just all circulated through a very tight-knit tape trading scene, and those were the people who knew about it. Those were the people who heard it. But it wasn't until people were exposed to Napalm that it kind of became this. It became a different global movement. You know what I mean? Like, without Napalm, maybe another band is the band that gets picked and is played, and history changes a little bit. But they're the first band that people really got to hear outside of the people who were deeply involved in that scene. And that's what you have to kind of focus on in terms of their importance. Not that maybe they were the fastest band of the era or the first band to play that fast, but they were the first band to be recognized outside the community.
Yeah.
Yeah, and their longevity kind of holds that as well.
Well, and I think
Definitely.
And I think too that they stayed a band. For anything you want to say, Terrorizer is sort of a one and done, and that's even years later that they record that. And the same kind of goes for Repulsion. That stuff was only really available on a couple, 7 inches and some tape trades and things like that. But they never had proper release, like say a Scum, which, even though you said it didn't get a lot of like American distribution, at least it's a recorded record,
Right.
And they're not going to break up right afterwards or fizzle and disappear into a billion other bands like a Terrorizer did.
But the interesting thing is they could have. Especially the way that Scum is constructed, because Scum is essentially 2 different recordings from 2 different bands. And if not for Mick Harris's desire to keep Napalm going after Side A is recorded, that could have very well happened. You know what I mean? They could have been done and splintered and done something different, but he just basically rebuilt the band from scratch and put together the lineup that recorded Side B, and that moved the band forward for the next few years.
Can you think of another example of that? Like, I guess in metal history, where a non-original member has essentially picked up the ashes and led them, I guess, to even bigger and better
Opeth?
Things. Yeah, I guess Opeth.
It's not quite as
It's not as
interesting
dramatic,
of a story, but yeah.
But it is such an uncanny story. You don't hear of that very often, where a non-original member is the only guy left standing, and then all of a sudden he takes it and makes it this global entity.
Yeah. Now Opeth is a good band to throw out there for something like that. I'm sure if I attempted to think long enough and hard enough, I could come up with a couple that are good, but there's not going to be one better than that. So
Yeah.
let's roll with that.
Okay, yeah, we'll go with that. There you go, Mark. Good job, Mark.
I think
Opeth reference.
I do what I can. And then after Mick kind of takes off, Shane's kind of the driving force of the band at that point, correct?
Yeah. I would say by the time Shane joins the band in '87, after Jim leaves. Actually, Shane was asked to join before Jim joined the band, and didn't. I think he was actually asked to join as the guitarist before Bill joined, because Shane and Mick were good friends at the time. But as Shane would say it, he kind of chickened out and decided not to do it. But when he eventually replaces Jim in '87, he becomes, he's obviously the longest tenured member of Napalm Death currently, and I think it's safe to say that after Mick leaves in '91, Shane becomes, in a lot of ways, I think, the heart and soul of Napalm Death from that moment on.
Yeah.
Now, as far as, because I don't know if I've ever really seen this necessarily documented or talked about too much, but the actual, unless it was purely a group effort, when Mick is kind of like the sole remaining guy in the band and reassembling, who who kind of picks up like the songwriting credits? Is this something that's usually attributed to the whole band, or did Shane really interject a lot, or did Steer, or?
I think, well, I know that Mick was actually writing some stuff crudely on guitar also. So I think Mick was involved in the songwriting, even a little bit after he joined the lineup with Bolin and Broderick. But I gotta think that if you listen to the side B of Scum, there's a lot of Bill Scare on that.
Yeah.
And then I think that by the time they get to From Enslavement to Obliteration, you hear more of Shane kind of coming in and contributing a bit more. You hear Mick being more and more comfortable. You hear Bill doing his thing. So yeah. I think that it becomes more of a cohesive unit by the time you get to From Enslavement to Obliteration.
Because with that record, when I hear From Enslavement, which is kind of where Scum moves to now, to me it's way more focused. I mean, obviously they have I guess a semi-regular, stable lineup other than adding Shane. You've got Lee really sort of figuring out how to use his voice more efficiently than what he did on side B, and Bill's really kind of actually learning his, I guess, trademark guitar tone. I mean, he's almost really getting that. It's a lot less punky in a lot of ways, though, too. It's a colder record. It's a much more punishing record in a lot of ways. I mean, where do how do you see this evolution, I guess, taking place after you go from side B into, I guess, the first fully realized work of Napalm, which is, From Enslavement, which isn't two different bands. It's one work for the first time. I
think that what you see is a band that's more extreme, really. It's tighter and more focused. It's vocally, it's more extreme. Lyrically, I think Lee has kind of got it together a little bit more, because I know that when he was drafted for the side B of Scum, he was kind of flying by the seat of his pants in a lot of ways with his vocals and his lyrics. But at this point, I think everybody's just more comfortable, and I think everybody has pushed things further, basically. Mick is playing faster even. Lee's vocals, as Mark pointed out earlier, were really unintelligible, more or less, and just really deep and gorilla-like. It's a weird record. It's not one of my favorites. A lot of the grindcore purists adore that record. That's the one that they come back to. You know, you get like the people who are the kind of, lack of a better term, let's call them the elitists, who don't really want to recognize Napalm past the quote-unquote classic era of Dorian, Steer.
Yeah, past Mentally Murdered kind of stuff.
Right. And that's like, Fido is a record that they latch on to.
And I think I think that what you were saying, though, it's probably because it's such a cold record, in a way. I mean, to me, it's very, I don't want to say detached in a way, but you're right. It's not a record like I pull out very often. I don't think it's one you pull out very often.
No, just select cuts here and there. It's not a entirety record, that's for sure.
But I can see
it's their least accessible recording, I think. I think there's something, like, it's recorded well. I mean, like, everything is captured well, but I think just the basic tones on it are just really brutal and alienating to a lot of people, you know?
Yeah, I mean, even in, like, a song like we're going to open up with here, Unchallenged Hate, I mean, that is just a pure evil, metallic, heavy song in every sense of the word, and it's very taxing in a way. But I mean, that's good if that's what they're trying to do. It's just not something you want to, necessarily pull out and headbang to in the same way you might want to hear, like, say, Scum or some of the later stuff. So,
right.
Before we go quick into break, I guess, because it's kind of attached to it, Mentally Murdered, really quick, is recorded a year after, in 1989, with essentially the same lineup. You've got, except for Jesse Pintado, right, has been added as the second guitarist.
No, he isn't there yet. There's still a 4-piece with Mentally Murdered.
Oh, really? Okay. Again, Metallium lying to me as I did some research this morning. So those bastards.
But at one point, Pintado had joined, and then
but couldn't get a work via. Yeah, we'll get into
there's all
that
that
stuff
kind of
with
stuff.
Harmony.
Oh yeah, all that good stuff.
But I guess, one thing about Mentally Murdered really quick, before we sort of go into this next set of music, for me, if you're talking about pure grindcore, I think this is maybe the best pound for pound 15 minutes of pure grindcore that maybe has ever been recorded, and certainly I think, from my opinion, by Napalm Death. What's your feel on Mentally Murdered?
I absolutely love Mentally Murdered, and part of the main reason for me is what we kind of discussed earlier, is about the sound and the tones. For as kind of tinny and alienating as the tones are on From Enslavement to Obliteration, Mentally Murdered's guitar sound is so thick and crushing and so death metal, really.
Yeah.
Like when I hear that, that's when...
Like Rise Above especially has that perfect
Right.
steer tone, riff,
it sounds wicked. I absolutely love it. And, Bill is introducing a few more guitar lines and guitar solos in there
Walls
that I
of
think work
Confinement
really well.
has that great solo at the end, So, if you can call it that, but, I think it's pretty sweet.
But yeah, for me, that record is really, that's like an incredibly important transitional EP. I mean, and that's what it is. Ultimately, it's a transitional EP, but it's awesome. And it's, for what it is, it's really like a great document. I think it's the best thing that lineup ever recorded.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
And maybe one of the last pure grind records that they'll ever put together, in a way. So, I guess unfettered by death metal.
That's
It's not a dirty word.
It isn't. It isn't. But we're talking about the purity earlier that Albert was bringing up. So, all right. So let's listen to some tunage here. We've got a trio of tracks from Enslavement to Obliteration, Unchallenged Hate, Lucid Fairy Tale, and Retreat to Nowhere. Then we've got Rise Above, Mentally Murdered, Walls of Confinement from the Mentally Murdered EP, and then we're going to close with If Truth Be Known and Stuff for the Children from Harmony Corruption, which we'll talk about when we come back. That was Suffer the Children, If Truth Be Known, Walls of Confinement, Mentally Murdered, Rise Above, Retreat to Nowhere, Lucid Fairy Tale, and Unchallenged Hate. And there will be a test on that later. So, but what we heard there at the very end, Albert, is a kind of a new sound, a new vocalist. This is Enter Barney, correct?
It is. Barney Greenway, formerly of Birmingham Boar Meddlers. Sorry, Mark. Benediction.
Oh, come on. Everybody has a hard-on about Benediction. They think they're terrible. They're sloppy and fun. Just like, well, I won't say that, but yeah.
Just like girls at bars.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so, but I mean, Barney, and he's definitely bringing something new now that Lee's gone,
I think it's the first time Napalm's actually had a formidable vocalist.
I wouldn't disagree with that. I think that, to just quickly kind of recap what's happened by this point, Shane and Mick are the only remaining members now. Lee Dorian has left. He'll go on and start Cathedral, and Bill Steer has left and is now concentrating on Carcass full time. So what happens then is, again, Mick Harris has to repopulate the lineup. He goes and gets Barney Greenway and drafts first Jesse Pendato from Terrorizer, and then about 6 months later gets Mitch Harris, formerly of Righteous Pigs. So he brings in two Yanks into the Limey lineup, and you get the Harmony Corruption album, which is a much different beast than anything Napalm has done prior to that.
And I love this record when I first heard it because, of course, I was a death metal fan coming into grindcore, not the opposite. A grindcore fan trying to go into death metal. And so, again, I guess, like you said, it's perspective where you enter with a band like Napalm,
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely, I'm the same way with that record. That again, that's the first Napalm record I have heard, and it is their most death metal record. And, hearing that in the early 90s when death metal was really king, to me, I didn't, I thought, oh, this is just what this is supposed to sound like. I had no idea that there was this huge perceived controversy at the time, but there was, because Napalm had made a pretty sizable aesthetical shift and incorporated a lot more of the Florida death metal sound, notably drafting Scott Burns from Morrisound Studios to produce the album, and the band flying out to Florida and recording the whole thing out there and attempting to capture a lot of the tones that were on death records and obituary records and stuff like that, and bringing them into Napalm sound. And for a lot of people it was really exciting and awesome, and for a lot of other people it was kind of disappointing, and for some other people it was completely confusing.
Yeah. I mean, even drafting guys like Glenn Benton and John Tardy as guest vocalists, you got
that's right,
Mick, you got Mick doing a lot more, I guess, pure death metal double bass kind of stuff, more intricate cymbal work. Barney's kind of throwing out a lot of Tom G kind of, Tom G Warrior type, kind of screams and different things. And, to me, it's just a cool evolution, a cool amalgamation of the whole extreme metal scene in general, Yeah.
But I mean, it's a hell of a shift. I especially like the focus on, even though it's Harmony Corruption, but there is a ton of harmony and melody and hook, even more so, on this record. And I think that's the initial thing that kind of caught me, was every song has some kind of memorable hook to the thing, and having that kind of, relationship with the Obituary sound. The guitar tone on Harmony Corruption is almost verbatim what Obituary was sounding like at the time, but played much better.
Yeah. I think you hear a lot of the Death Leprosy guitar tone too. I know that in particular Mick Harris was really into that record, and I think that generally he was into that record for the drum sound, and because you've got Bill Andrews just playing his really straightforward beats that have a lot of space between them. I think the drums on that record sounded really big, whereas the drums on Harmony Corruption, I think Mick was trying to emulate that sound, but his style of playing didn't really allow it to sound as cool and as big as it does on Leprosy.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, you're even hearing American grind influences too. Like I think of the opening of If Truth Be Known, like has a very much a kind of a Terrorizer, sort of Fear of Napalm catchiness to it. You know what I mean?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, but I mean, you've got the guitarist from Terrorizer in the band.
Yeah.
You've got the guitarist from Righteous Pigs. So obviously that stuff is coming through a little bit more clearly than before. Like the influences now are a part of the band, literally.
And the funny story that we were alluding to earlier is that Jesse was asked to join the band just to be like a singular guitarist. They were only looking at as one guitar player, and then he couldn't get his work visa sort of situation sort of straightened out to be able to come over to England, and so that's when they went and got Mitch to join the band from Righteous Pigs, and then all of a sudden Jesse got his stuff sort of worked out, and so here we are. We got two guitarists now, so.
And the confusion of Mick Harris and Mitch Harris begins.
Yeah.
Oh my God, yeah. My 15-year-old brain couldn't process that.
And then
what do you mean they're not related?
Harris and Harris. Whoa, these are brothers doing this band? Great.
Yeah. I couldn't keep those guys straight for a long time, so I was in the same boat.
Personalities couldn't be more different.
No,
yes,
not at all. And I've never had an opportunity to meet Mick before, but I do remember the first time I met Napalm when they were on tour with At the Gates, that tour back in '96, the Curse to Tour tour. We grilled burritos together on the Napalm Death At the Gates tour bus, and sat and actually had a conversation about food for a while. And I was a high school kid, so I was just enamored the whole time, like in awe. Like, is this really happening? Am I talking to the guitar player from Napalm? And so very cool guy. I do remember that. But I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about the controversy, but we do have to sort of wrap things up with this first show in a moment. But I mean, what can you say about this record to people maybe that were never able to advance with it? Maybe just the old school Napalm fans that still don't like Harmony.
I guess I'd have to say to them, if they're still interested in grindcore and if they're still interested in extreme music in general, that you have to approach Harmony as a necessary step in Napalm's evolution, just because it was obviously a bit more calculated drafting death metal players or more death metal influenced players into the lineup after Steer and Dorian leave. But if they don't do this, they can't really evolve, and they'll be done. And I know that the purists aren't particularly enamored with that record and a lot of the early to mid 90s output that followed it. But with what Napalm are doing now, they could never do what they're doing now if they hadn't done that record.
Yeah, that's good point. So, and a good point to sort of end things with for this part one of Napalm Death history. We're going to close things out with Siege of Power, the re-recording. This was originally appeared on Scum and some of the old demos and stuff, and they re-recorded it with Barney and some of the new lineup for the Suffer the Children EP in 1990, and it's kind of a nice kind of way to come full circle with this band, in a way. You've got the original song kind of coming back together. So anyways, shoot us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com. Let us know what you thought. Check us out on Facebook. Check us out at the website, requiempodcast.com.
And most importantly, stay chuffed.
Stay chuffed. And once again, thank you to Nick Green for supporting this with a generous donation. And Albert, rumor has it, is going to stick around. So we hope you also stick around and wait for part two. Enjoy.
Yeah, I'll be here next week.
Okay, yeah. He's going to stay on the phone for about 7 days for us, and then we'll get to part two. So enjoy Siege of Power as we close things out.